The setting sun cast long shadows across Mrs. Rose's front porch as she settled into her favorite rocking chair, a worn photo album resting in her lap. At 78, she had grown used to quiet evenings in her beautiful old Victorian house, the same one she'd called home for over 4 decades. The neighborhood had changed around her, families moved in and out, trees grew taller, and children who once played on her sidewalk now had children of their own. That particular October evening felt different somehow. Dark clouds had been gathering all afternoon, bringing with them that special kind of silence that comes just before rain. Mrs. Rose had just finished making herself a cup of chamomile tea when the first droplets started falling, pattering against her windows like tiny fingers tapping on glass. She wasn't expecting any visitors, she rarely did these days. Her own children had grown up and moved to different states, calling regularly but visiting only during holidays. Most of her friends had either passed away or moved into retirement communities, leaving her as one of the few original residents still living on Maple Street. The sound of her doorbell ringing cut through the quiet like a sudden thunderclap, making her jump slightly in her chair. For a moment, she considered pretending she wasn't home. After all, who could be visiting at this hour, especially in this weather? But something made her set down her tea and make her way to the door, her slippered feet shuffling across the polished hardwood floors she still maintained meticulously. Looking through the peephole, she saw nothing at first. Then, adjusting her gaze downward, she spotted them, 2 small faces peering up at her front door, barely visible beneath matching yellow raincoats that seemed to glow in the dim evening light. Children, she realized, and identical twins at that. Mrs. Rose's heart softened immediately. Despite her initial hesitation, she couldn't leave little ones standing out in the rain. She opened the door, and the sight before her made her catch her breath. The twins couldn't have been more than 8 years old, their dark eyes bright with intelligence and something else. Was it determination? Their little faces were so perfectly matched that it was like seeing a reflection in a mirror, right down to the way they'd both tilted their heads slightly to the right as they looked up at her. "Good evening, ma'am," they said in perfect unison, their voices clear and polite despite the weather. "Would it be all right if we came inside? We have something very important to tell you." There was something about their manner, so proper, so grown-up, that tugged at Mrs. Rose's memory. In all her years, she'd never seen children quite like these. They weren't like the usual neighborhood kids who sometimes rang her doorbell selling cookies or school fundraiser items. These 2 had an air of purpose about them, standing straight and tall despite their small size, their hands clasped in front of them like little diplomats. "We promise we won't take much of your time," the twin on the left added, water dripping from her raincoat onto the welcome mat. "But what we have to say, it's about your house and someone who used to live here a long time ago." A strange feeling washed over Mrs. Rose, like the ghost of a memory trying to surface. She found herself stepping back, opening the door wider. "Well, we can't have you catching cold out there, can we? Come in, come in. Let's get you both dried off and warmed up." As the twins stepped into her foyer, their little boots squeaking against the floor, Mrs. Rose noticed how they looked around the entrance hall with familiar curiosity, as if confirming something they already knew. They carefully removed their raincoats, revealing matching blue sweaters underneath, and followed her instructions to hang them on the coat rack by the door. "My grandmother used to hang her coat on that very same rack," the twin on the right whispered, so quietly that Mrs. Rose almost missed it. The words sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool air from outside. "Why don't we go into the kitchen?" Mrs. Rose suggested, her voice wavering slightly. "I think this calls for some hot chocolate, and then you can tell me exactly what brought you to my door on this rainy evening." As she led them through her house, Mrs. Rose couldn't shake the feeling that this visit was about to change everything. She just didn't know how much. Mrs. Rose's kitchen had always been a place of comfort, filled with the lingering sense of fresh-baked cookies and afternoon tea. Now, as she worked at the counter preparing hot chocolate for her unexpected guests, she couldn't help but notice how naturally the twins settled into their seats at her old oak table, the very same table that had hosted countless family meals and afternoon conversations over the past 40 years. "Would you like marshmallows in your hot chocolate?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the strange feelings stirring in her chest. The way these children moved about her kitchen felt so familiar, yet she was certain she'd never met them before. "Yes, please," the twin on the right answered softly, her small fingers tracing the wood-grain patterns on the table. "3 marshmallows, if it's not too much trouble." She paused, then added, "That's how our grandmother liked it too." Mrs. Rose nearly dropped the mug she was holding. Those words, so simple, yet they sent another wave of that strange déjà vu washing over her. As she turned to face the children, she noticed little details she'd missed before. The way the girl held herself, shoulders straight but relaxed, reminded her so much of someone from her past. And when the boy reached up to brush his hair from his face, she caught sight of something behind his left ear. A tiny heart-shaped birthmark. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the mugs down in front of them. The steam rose in delicate spirals, carrying the rich scent of chocolate through the kitchen. The boy wrapped his hands around his mug exactly the way someone else used to, so many years ago, someone who had once been as familiar to Mrs. Rose as her own reflection. "Thank you," the twins said together, and even their gratitude carried echoes of the past. The girl lifted her cup with practiced grace, pinky finger slightly raised, a gesture so specific, so particular, that Mrs. Rose had to sit down. "I hope you don't mind us asking," the boy began, his voice gentle as he sipped his hot chocolate, "but has this kitchen always looked the same? The yellow curtains, the flower-patterned wallpaper?" Mrs. Rose glanced at the curtains. They weren't the originals, but she'd always chosen the same sunny yellow when replacing them. "The wallpaper is new," she admitted, "but I picked the same pattern that was here when we first bought the house. My husband used to say it made the room feel like springtime all year round." The twins exchanged a meaningful look, the kind that suggested they were sharing thoughts without words, something only twins can do. The girl reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out something that looked like a piece of paper, but she didn't show it yet. Instead, she asked, "Did you ever wonder about the people who lived here before you, Mrs. Rose?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, heavy with unspoken meaning. Mrs. Rose's fingers tightened around her own mug as memories began to surface, memories she'd tucked away so carefully over the years. "There were stories," she said slowly, watching the twins' expressions. "The previous owners were a family called the Hendersons, but before them," she trailed off, her mind wandering down corridors of the past she hadn't visited in decades. The boy leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting hers with that same unsettling wisdom. "And after you moved in, who else became part of this house's story?" Mrs. Rose felt her heart skip a beat. There had been others, of course, the parade of neighbors, friends, and help that passed through any family home over the years. But something in the boy's tone suggested he was asking about someone specific. "We had a housekeeper," she found herself saying, the words coming out almost of their own accord. "She was more than that, really. She was—" Mrs. Rose's voice caught as a face emerged from her memories, clear as yesterday. A young woman with kind eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest day. The girl finally placed what she'd been holding onto the table, sliding it carefully across the polished wood. It was a photograph, worn at the edges and creased down the middle as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. Mrs. Rose reached for it with fingers that suddenly felt numb. "Before you look at it," the boy said softly, "we want you to know that we're here because of love, not anger. Our grandmother made us promise to remember that." Mrs. Rose's hand hovered over the photograph, her heart pounding in her chest. Something told her that once she looked at this picture, everything would change. The twins watched her with gentle patience, their hot chocolate cooling between them, as the kitchen clock ticked steadily in the background and the rain continued its gentle pattern against the windows. Finally, with a deep breath, she picked up the photograph. As her eyes fell on the image, the world seemed to stop spinning for just a moment. There, standing proudly in front of this very house, was a face she hadn't seen in over 40 years, a face that had haunted her dreams and lingered in the corners of her memory like a beautiful ghost. The photograph trembled in Mrs. Rose's hands as she stared at the image before her. The young woman in the nurse's uniform stood tall and proud, her smile radiating warmth even through the faded colors of the old picture. The backdrop was unmistakable, the same red brick walls, the same arched doorway, the same curved windows that Mrs. Rose now looked through every morning. But it was the date stamped in the corner that made her breath catch, June 1963. "Miss Clara," Mrs. Rose whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft drumming of rain against the windows. The name felt both foreign and familiar on her tongue, like a long-forgotten lullaby suddenly remembered. The twins watched her carefully, their hot chocolate now forgotten. The kitchen seemed to grow smaller, more intimate, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen to what would come next. "You recognize her," the girl said. It wasn't a question. She reached across the table and gently touched Mrs. Rose's hand. "Our grandmother always said you would." Mrs. Rose couldn't take her eyes off the photograph. Clara was. She was special to this house. To all of us. Her fingers traced the outline of Clara's face in the picture. "She came to work for us when we first moved in, but she became so much more than just our housekeeper. She had this way about her, she could make anyone feel like they mattered." The boy nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. "She told us stories about this house. About the secret hiding place in the pantry where she used to keep candies for the neighborhood children. About the creaky third step on the back stairs that nobody ever fixed because it made such a good burglar alarm." Mrs. Rose laughed softly, despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "That step still creaks. I never had the heart to fix it." She looked up at the twins, really looking at them now. "You have her eyes. Both of you. That same sparkle when you smile." "She wanted us to give you something else," the girl said, reaching into her pocket again. This time she pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. She wrote this a long time ago, but she could never bring herself to send it. Mrs. Rose accepted the envelope with shaking hands. The address was written in Clara's unmistakable handwriting, elegant cursive that flowed across the paper like music. She'd seen that handwriting so many times before, on shopping lists and reminder notes pinned to the kitchen board. "Before you read it," the boy said, his voice gentle but firm, "there's something you should know. Something about why our grandmother left that winter morning." The kitchen seemed to grow colder at his words. Mrs. Rose had always wondered about that day. The day she came downstairs to find Clara gone. No note, no explanation, just the echo of her presence in the empty rooms. "She didn't just disappear," the girl continued, her young voice carrying the weight of history. "She found something in the study that scared her. Papers that belonged to your husband." Mrs. Rose felt her heart skip a beat. George's study had always been his private space, filled with documents and letters she never questioned. He'd been a prominent man in the community, involved in all sorts of local organizations and committees. The papers showed that some people in town were planning terrible things, the boy explained carefully. They wanted to hurt families who looked like ours, who looked like grandmother. The truth settled over Mrs. Rose like a heavy blanket. She remembered those times, the tension in the air, the whispered conversations, the changes sweeping through their small town. But George had never seemed part of it. He'd always treated Clara with respect, had even insisted on paying for her nursing classes. "But there's more to the story," the girl added quickly, seeing the color drain from Mrs. Rose's face. "Grandmother didn't tell us until she was very sick, just before she passed away. She said we needed to know the whole truth, not just part of it." Mrs. Rose clutched the envelope tighter, her eyes moving between the twins' earnest faces and the photograph still lying on the table. Clara's smile seemed to hold secrets now, mysteries waiting to be revealed. "Your husband," the boy said softly, "he found out what some people were planning. And instead of staying quiet, he helped our grandmother escape. He arranged for her to leave town safely, gave her money to start over somewhere new." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Mrs. Rose processed these words. George had never said a word, had carried this secret to his grave. She remembered how quiet he'd been in the weeks after Clara left, how he'd spend long hours in his study, how he'd sometimes stand at the kitchen window, staring out at nothing. "He protected both of you," the girl explained. "By not telling you, he made sure you couldn't accidentally reveal anything to the wrong people. Grandmother said he was a good man caught in a bad time, trying his best to do the right thing." Mrs. Rose unfolded the letter with trembling fingers, but before she could begin reading, the boy spoke again. "There's one more thing you should know, Mrs. Rose. When our grandmother left that night, she was carrying a secret of her own. She was going to have twins too. Our mother and aunt." The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next in this kitchen, where past and present had suddenly collided. Mrs. Rose looked at these children. Clara's grandchildren and saw the story come full circle. They were here not to accuse or blame, but to heal, to understand, to bridge a gap that had stayed open far too long. The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the background as Mrs. Rose unfolded Clara's letter with trembling hands. The twins sat quietly, their presence both comforting and overwhelming. Outside, the rain had settled into a gentle rhythm, as if nature itself was trying to soothe the emotions filling the room. "Would you like us to give you some privacy?" the girl asked softly, already starting to rise from her chair. But Mrs. Rose shook her head. "No, please stay," she whispered. I think I need you here for this." She smoothed the creased paper, Clara's familiar handwriting swimming before her tear-filled eyes. "Dear Mrs. Rose," she began reading aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. "By the time you read this, many years will have passed. I've started this letter 100 times, but the words never seemed right. How do you explain to someone why you vanished from their life without a goodbye?" Mrs. Rose paused, taking a shaky breath. The boy reached across the table and placed his small hand over hers, a gesture so much like his grandmother's that it made her heart ache. "The night I left," she continued reading, "I was scared and confused. I'd found those papers in Mr. Rose's study, plans for keeping families like mine out of certain neighborhoods, documents about upcoming protests. My heart broke because I thought I knew your husband, thought I knew your family. But then I found something else, something that changed everything." The twins exchanged knowing looks as Mrs. Rose turned the page. There was another set of papers, hidden behind the others. Your husband had been working secretly with people from the church, creating safe routes out of town for families who were being threatened. He was risking everything to help people escape to safer places. Tears fell freely down Mrs. Rose's cheeks now, spotting the old paper. All these years, she'd never known this side of George, never understood the weight he carried alone. "When he caught me in his study that night, I thought it was the end," the letter continued. "But instead of being angry, he looked relieved. He told me people were planning something terrible for the following week, and I needed to leave town immediately. He had already arranged everything: money, contacts, a safe place to stay up north." The girl got up quietly and brought Mrs. Rose a box of tissues from the counter. The simple gesture, so caring and thoughtful, reminded her again of Clara. "I didn't tell him I was pregnant," Mrs. Rose read on, her voice catching. "I wasn't sure myself then, but I was carrying twins, your mother and aunt." She looked up at the children. "He helped me escape, not knowing he was saving 3 lives that night." The boy nodded solemnly. "Mom always said it was like a miracle, how everything worked out. Grandmother made it safely to her cousin's house in another state, where she could finish her nursing degree. She met our grandfather there." Mrs. Rose returned to the letter, reading through details of Clara's new life. How she'd become a respected nurse, raised her twin daughters, found love again. But there was more, so much more beneath the surface of those words. "I never told anyone the full truth about your husband," the letter continued. "In those days, being known as someone who helped people like me could be dangerous. He protected me, so I protected him. But the hardest part was knowing I had to leave you in the dark, Mrs. Rose. You were more than just my employer, you were my friend." The kitchen seemed to grow warmer as she read, filled with memories of shared laughter, quiet conversations over late-night tea, the simple joy of working together to make a house a home. "George knew that the less you knew, the safer you'd be," Mrs. Rose read, understanding finally dawning in her heart. "He carried that burden alone to protect both of us. I watched you from afar over the years, through mutual friends who still lived in town. I knew when George passed away, and I wanted to reach out then, but the timing never seemed right." The twins were listening intently, though they must have heard this story many times before. Their faces showed the same mix of sadness and hope that Mrs. Rose felt in her heart. "Now that I'm getting older," the letter went on, "I realize some things are too important to leave unsaid. I want you to know that I never blamed you for what happened. Those were difficult times, and good people often found themselves caught between what was safe and what was right. Your husband chose what was right, and that choice gave me and my family a chance at a better life." Mrs. Rose had to pause again, overwhelmed by the weight of these revelations. All these years, she'd carried guilt about Clara's disappearance, never knowing the full story, never understanding the courage and sacrifice that had shaped that winter night. I'm sending my grandchildren to you because they represent hope. She read the final paragraph, her voice growing stronger. They are the living proof that love and courage can overcome the darkest times. They are our shared legacy, Mrs. Rose, yours, mine, and George's. A reminder that doing the right thing, even in secret, can change lives for generations to come. The letter ended with a simple signature, "With eternal gratitude, Clara." Mrs. Rose carefully folded the letter and looked at the twins, seeing them with new eyes. They weren't just Clara's grandchildren now. They were living proof of her husband's secret courage, of Clara's strength, of love's power to reach across decades and heal old wounds. "There's one more thing," the boy said, reaching into his pocket. "Grandmother wanted you to have this too." He pulled out a small, worn key on a faded blue ribbon. "She said you'd know what it opens." Mrs. Rose stared at the small key resting in the boy's palm, its brass surface dulled with age but still familiar. The blue ribbon had faded to a soft sky color, but she recognized it instantly. It was the same ribbon Clara used to tie back her hair during busy days in this very kitchen. "The hope chest," Mrs. Rose whispered, her eyes widening with recognition. "In the attic." The twins looked at each other, excitement flickering across their identical faces. The girl spoke first. "Grandmother said there was something special up there. Something she left behind that night, something she couldn't carry with her but couldn't bear to throw away." Mrs. Rose pushed her chair back slowly, her legs feeling unexpectedly steady despite all the evening's revelations. "Would you like to see it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The twins nodded eagerly, rising from their chairs with the natural grace of youth. The journey up to the attic felt like walking through time itself. Each step of the old staircase seemed to creak with memories, 40 years of footsteps, of whispered conversations, of life flowing through this old house. Mrs. Rose led the way with a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness like a sword through cobwebs. "Watch your step, dears," she cautioned as they reached the attic door. "Not many people come up here anymore." She pulled the chain for the single light bulb, and warm yellow light flooded the space, revealing shapes draped in old sheets like sleeping giants. The twins stayed close behind her as she made her way to the far corner, where a large chest sat beneath the circular window. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight as she knelt down beside it, her joints protesting but her heart racing with anticipation. "Your grandmother and I found this chest at a second-hand store," Mrs. Rose explained, running her hand over the worn wood. "We spent a whole Saturday afternoon refinishing it together. She said every woman needed a special place to keep her treasures." The key slid into the lock as smoothly as if it had been used yesterday. The mechanism turned with a soft click that seemed to echo in the quiet attic. The twins held their breath as Mrs. Rose lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and memories wafted up from the chest. On top lay a carefully folded quilt, its colors still bright despite the years. "Your grandmother made this," Mrs. Rose said softly, lifting it out. "She was teaching me to quilt, but I never had her talent for it." Beneath the quilt were several old notebooks, their pages filled with Clara's elegant handwriting. "Her nursing school notes," Mrs. Rose explained, touching them gently. "She studied so hard, staying up late at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed." But it was what lay at the bottom of the chest that made Mrs. Rose gasp. A small wooden box, intricately carved with roses and vines, sat nestled in a bed of yellowed tissue paper. "I've never seen this before," she whispered, lifting it carefully. The boy reached out to steady the box as she opened it, revealing a collection of photographs, letters, and small treasures. Each item told a piece of Clara's story: her acceptance letter to nursing school, a pressed flower from the garden, a small silver locket. "Look," the girl said softly, pointing to a photograph near the bottom. It showed Clara and Mrs. Rose standing in the garden, their arms around each other, laughing at something now lost to time. On the back, Clara had written, "My dearest friend, more than an employer, the sister I never had." Mrs. Rose touched the words gently, remembering the day the photo was taken. "We were planting roses," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your grandmother insisted that every home needed a rose garden. She said flowers had a way of healing hearts." The twins sat close to her on either side as she continued through the box's contents. Each item revealed another layer of Clara's life, another thread in the tapestry of their shared history. There were birthday cards the Rose children had made for her, recipes written in both their handwritings, even a small drawing of the house done by George himself. She kept everything. Mrs. Rose marveled, all these little pieces of our life together. At the very bottom of the box lay an envelope, sealed and addressed to Mrs. Rose in Clara's handwriting, dated just 3 months ago. The twins watched silently as she opened it with trembling fingers. "My dearest friend," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means I'd finally found the courage to send my grandchildren to you with the truth. They are my heart walking in the world, carrying the best of all of us, your kindness, George's courage, and my hope for the future." Mrs. Rose read on, tears falling freely now. Clara's words spoke of forgiveness, of gratitude, of the complex bonds that tie people together across time and circumstance. She wrote of her final days, peaceful and surrounded by family, knowing that this last task, this bridge between past and present, would soon be complete. "She passed away last month," the boy said quietly as Mrs. Rose folded the letter. "But she made us promise to wait until after her birthday to come see you. She said timing was everything." Mrs. Rose looked at the calendar hanging on the attic wall, its pages yellowed with age. Today would have been Clara's birthday. Even now, even after all these years, she was orchestrating moments of grace and healing. The girl reached into the box one last time and pulled out the silver locket. "Grandmother wanted you to have this back," she said, placing it in Mrs. Rose's hand. "She said it was time it came home." Mrs. Rose opened the locket with shaking fingers. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, one of Clara as a young woman and one of Mrs. Rose herself, both smiling, both full of hope for the future. A future that now sat beside her in the form of these remarkable children, carrying their grandmother's spirit in their gentle hearts. As the evening shadows lengthened, Mrs. Rose and the twins made their way back downstairs, carrying the wooden box like a precious treasure. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves had been holding these secrets, waiting for the right moment to share them. In the living room, Mrs. Rose settled into her favorite armchair while the twins sat cross-legged on the carpet before her. The box rested between them, and the silver locket gleamed softly in the lamp light around Mrs. Rose's neck. "Your grandmother," she began, touching the locket gently, "was the kind of person who could light up a whole room just by walking into it. Even on the hardest days, she found reasons to smile." She paused, looking at the twins' eager faces. "Would you like to hear some stories about her? The kind that aren't written down anywhere?" The children nodded enthusiastically, scooting closer to her chair. The girl hugged her knees to her chest while the boy rested his chin in his hands, both of them ready to soak up every word. "Well," Mrs. Rose said, smiling at a distant memory, "there was this one Christmas when everything seemed to go wrong. The turkey burned, the pipes froze, and your grandfather, my George, was stuck at work because of a snowstorm. I was about ready to give up and cry, but your grandmother? She just rolled up her sleeves and said, 'Well, looks like we're having an adventure.'" The twins grinned, clearly recognizing their grandmother's spirit in those words. Mrs. Rose continued, "She turned that disaster into one of our best Christmases ever. We made sandwiches, played board games by candlelight, and she taught my children all these wonderful songs she knew. When George finally made it home, he found us all wrapped in blankets, drinking hot cocoa, and laughing like we didn't have a care in the world." "That sounds just like her," the boy said softly. "She always said the best moments come from the worst surprises." Mrs. Rose nodded, reaching for another photograph from the box. "Look at this one," she said, showing them a picture of a garden in full bloom. "Your grandmother started this rose garden from nothing but a few wild cuttings. People said roses wouldn't grow in our soil, but she refused to believe them. She talked to those plants every morning while she had her coffee." The girl's eyes lit up. "Is that why she always had a rose pin on her nurse's uniform? We found it in her jewelry box after she—" Her voice trailed off, but Mrs. Rose understood. "Yes, dear. I gave her that pin when she graduated nursing school. She said it reminded her that beautiful things can grow anywhere if you give them enough love and patience." Mrs. Rose's voice grew thoughtful. "You know, that's how she treated everyone, like they were roses waiting to bloom. She could see the best in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves." The twins exchanged a look that seemed to hold volumes of meaning. The boy spoke up. "She said the same thing about you, Mrs. Rose. She told us that you were her first real friend in town, even when other people weren't very nice to her. Mrs. Rose felt tears welling up again, but these were different from before, lighter somehow, like spring rain instead of winter storms. Your grandmother taught me so much about friendship, about courage, about seeing people for who they really are instead of what others say about them. She reached into the box and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. This was her favorite book of poems. She used to read them aloud while we worked in the kitchen. Sometimes she'd make up her own verses about whatever we were doing, silly little rhymes about burnt cookies or stubborn stains. She made everything feel like an adventure. The girl leaned forward, touching the book's worn cover gently. She used to make up poems for us too, especially when we were sad or scared. She said words had magic in them if you arranged them just right. That they do, Mrs. Rose agreed, opening the book carefully. Pressed between its pages was a small piece of paper covered in Clara's handwriting. As she unfolded it, her heart skipped a beat. It was a poem Clara had written about their friendship, dated just days before she left. "Would you like to hear it?" she asked the twins, who nodded it eagerly. She cleared her throat and began to read. "In this house where love grows like roses, where friendship blooms in unlikely soil, we've planted seeds of understanding that time and fear cannot spoil. Though paths may lead us far from here, and years may come between, the garden of our hearts will flourish, with memories evergreen." The twins sat in respectful silence as Mrs. Rose's voice faded away. The boy reached up and touched her hand where it rested on the book. "Grandmother said you were the bravest person she knew, besides our grandfather." Mrs. Rose looked surprised. "Me? But I didn't do anything brave. Your grandmother, your grandfather, my George, they were the brave ones." The girl shook her head, wisdom beyond her years shining in her eyes. She said it takes just as much courage to open your heart as it does to stand up to bad people. She said you taught her that love is the bravest thing of all. Looking at these children, Clara's grandchildren, sitting in her living room, sharing memories and healing old wounds, Mrs. Rose finally understood what her old friend had meant. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't a grand gesture or a dramatic moment. Sometimes it's as simple as opening your door on a rainy evening, or offering friendship when others turn away, or keeping your heart open even after it's been broken. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, making Mrs. Rose realize how late it had grown. The rain outside had finally stopped, leaving behind a fresh, clean scent that drifted through the slightly opened windows. The twins' parents would be wondering where they were. "We should probably head home soon," the boy said, as if reading her thoughts. But there was reluctance in his voice, a wish to stay longer in this moment where past and present had woven together so beautifully. Mrs. Rose sat up straighter in her chair, suddenly remembering something. "Wait just a moment," she said, her eyes brightening. "There's one more thing I want to show you." She stood up slowly, making her way to the old secretary desk in the corner of the room. With careful movements, she pulled out a small drawer and reached into its depths. The twins watched curiously as she returned with a small envelope, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. "Your grandmother wasn't the only one who kept treasures," she said softly, sitting back down. "I've been saving this for, well, I suppose I've been saving it for a moment like this." Inside the envelope was a collection of small photographs, much newer than the ones in Clara's box. Mrs. Rose spread them out on the coffee table, and the twins leaned forward eagerly to see. "I had a friend who lived in your grandmother's new town," she explained, pointing to various images. "She would send me updates over the years, just little snippets of Clara's life. Here she is at her nursing graduation. And here, this is her wedding day. She looked so beautiful, so happy." The girl picked up one of the photos, studying it carefully. "That's our mom and aunt when they were babies," she exclaimed, showing it to her brother. Mrs. Rose nodded, smiling. "Yes, I knew about you all along in a way. I never reached out because I wasn't sure if it was what Clara wanted, but I kept every picture, every little piece of news that came my way. I watched your family grow from afar, celebrating each milestone in my heart." The boy looked up at her, his eyes shining. "So we were never really strangers, were we?" "No, dear," Mrs. Rose replied, touching his cheek gently. "You were always part of my family, even if we'd never met. Love doesn't need permission to cross distances or years. It just keeps growing, like Clara's roses." She stood up again, this time moving to the window. The streetlights outside cast a warm glow on the wet pavement, and in the garden, Clara's roses swayed gently in the evening breeze. "Would you like to take some cuttings home?" she asked. "These roses came from your grandmother's original plants. They've been growing here all these years, getting stronger and more beautiful with each season." The twins' faces lit up at the suggestion. Together, they walked out to the garden, where Mrs. Rose carefully showed them how to select the best stems for replanting, just as Clara had taught her so many years ago. "Remember," she instructed, demonstrating with gentle hands, "you cut just below a leaf node, at an angle. That gives the cutting the best chance to root." She smiled at their intense concentration. "Your grandmother taught me that. She said everything that grows needs both strength and tenderness." As they wrapped the cuttings carefully in damp paper towels, Mrs. Rose made a decision. "I'd like you both to come back," she said, her voice firm with certainty. "Not just once, but regularly. There are so many stories to share, so many memories in this house that belong to both our families. And I think," she paused, looking at their hopeful faces, "I think it's time to make some new memories too." The twins beamed at her, their smiles so much like Clara's that it made her heart swell. "We'd love that," the girl said, while her brother nodded enthusiastically. "And next time," Mrs. Rose continued, "bring your parents. I'd like to meet Clara's daughters. We can have tea in the garden among the roses your grandmother planted. I think she'd like that." As they prepared to leave, the twins gave Mrs. Rose tight hugs, as if they'd known her all their lives. Perhaps, in a way, they had. Their grandmother's love had created a bridge across time, connecting them long before they ever met. Standing in her doorway, watching them walk down the path where their grandmother had walked so many years ago, Mrs. Rose felt a profound sense of peace. The house behind her held decades of memories, some joyful, some painful, all precious. But now it also held the promise of new beginnings, of family bonds renewed, of love that had never really been lost, just waiting for the right moment to bloom again. She touched the locket at her neck, imagining she could feel Clara's presence in the evening air. "Thank you, old friend," she whispered. "Thank you for sending them home to me." As if in response, a gentle breeze stirred the rose bushes, carrying the sweet scent of flowers up to the porch. In that moment, Mrs. Rose knew that some stories don't end, they just keep growing, like Clara's roses, reaching always toward the light.